Hello, welcome to Headlines. Since the start of the war in Ukraine in February 2022, Russia has been subjected to new strict sanctions and export controls, unilaterally implemented by a group of countries led by the G7 members and the European Union. Although coordinated sanctions against Moscow have been in place since 2014 under different regimes, and Russia, due to its ongoing war effort in Ukraine, has now become the most sanctioned country in the world, the real intended crippling effect of those very measures has been increasingly questioned by many. First of all, sanctions and export controls against Russia are not based on any UN Security Council resolution, therefore lacking universal nature for obvious reasons. However massive the cumulative clout of G7 countries and the EU as a whole collectively may be, with these countries accounting for more than 50% of the global economy, it's also the case that there are quite a number of important players, most notably China, India, Turkey and Israel, that do not support the idea of active unilateral imposition of sanctions. However, there seems to be a fine distinction between refusing to join a sanctioning coalition against Russia and helping Moscow in circumvention of those punitive measures. Many analysts agree that Moscow has, over the years, sought alternative markets and established new routes and methods for circumvention. Armenia, for instance, a small nation in the South Caucasus, member of the Moscow-dominated Eurasian Economic Union, has been widely reported as being absolutely instrumental to Russian economy. Russia remains Armenia's top trading partner, with a trade turnover between these two nations having reportedly reached $12 billion figure by late 2024, giving rise to some questions about Yerevan's role as a conduit enabling Russia to bypass Western sanctions in terms of the facilitation of trade between sanctioned Russian entities and the international market, which, amongst other things, involves the re-export of Russian gold and gemstones to abroad, and also the re-export of dual-use goods and technologies crucial to Russia's military development. Although over the past few years, individuals and entities in third countries such as Armenia have become focal point of attention, the actual Western response to this nation's role has been somewhat subdued. Nevertheless, it is in this light that the British government's latest advisory on sanctions export matters, designed guidance for exporters, lists Armenia as a country of concern. Joining me now from Brussels, from the very heart of the European Union, is Vlad Altenau, Senior EU Legal and Policy Expert. Mr. Altenau, welcome to Headlines.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. In principle, why do you think those sanctions that were intended to have crippling effect on Russian economy have so far failed?
I think there are probably quite a few reasons why the sanctions have not fully worked. And probably one of the main reasons is that, as you very rightly pointed in the presentation, if you sanction somebody by even 50+% of the global GDP countries, but you leave alone 40+% of GDP, that means that not everybody is going to follow those sanctions. That means that there are conduits, which means that there are escapes and escape routes for the sanctioned country around the main sanctions regime. And in this case, because those conduits have been either smaller countries such as Armenia or very large countries, members of the Security Council of the United Nations, such as China, probably what happened there is that Russia found its ways out of the sanctions regime for most of its production economy. So at the end of the day, Russia is an economy who would export resources. They would export energy, oil, gas, or they would export gold, gems, so basically resources. And they will import what? Technology. If in the combination of the 40+ GDP countries of the world who do not respect the sanctions regime or do not fully respect the sanctions regime of the other, the trade is possible. In other words, they need resources and they are willing to get those resources and bring technology back to Russia, then Russia will be able to escape those Western sanctions.
Different countries in different parts of the world do have their own interests. Some of them trade with Russia. Some of them are in a very precarious geopolitical situation. Some of them have some ideological reasons, like countries like in South America. Is it possible, legally speaking, to be absolutely neutral when it comes to sanctions imposed against Russia? So is there, as I mentioned during my introduction, do you agree with that moment that there is a distinction, very subtle but still clearly pronounced distinction, between not being part of anti-Russian coalition and helping Russia in terms of circumvention of those sanctions? So first one being a sort of a neutral position, second one being indirect involvement in helping Russia. Would that be a fair assessment of the situation, you think?
Probably yes. Probably yes. So there is, of course, there are the two parts of the argument. There is the legality part. So in other words, do I take part into the legal argument? Because that legal argument absolutely forces extraterritoriality. So in other words, me as the European Union, I would impose sanctions on Russia, but I depend on the neighboring countries of Russia to respect that regime. So there is a principle of extraterritoriality, and of course that there is also the principle of legality. Can we somehow implement that international law into national law into an efficient manner? And then there is a much more pragmatic analysis. And here we need to get, morality aside. Here in the West, we have this moral angle that they look at things. I think we should get that moral angle a bit aside and think a bit like Henry Kissinger. Now, at the end of the day, in a very pragmatic way, some of the countries are linked economically to Russia, and they simply need that economic link to be maintained. And this is, I gave before the example of China, that is clearly the case. If I need energy to boost my economy and the sources of energy are scarce on the global market, I can only import gas and oil from where they are made. And there are so many countries and so many routes that I can take. So pragmatically speaking, and I don't think that there is necessarily a moral angle. It's more a pragmatic economic angle. I need those resources, so I'm going to actually maintain that relationship. And same, I think, goes with quite a few of the South American countries, which actually have a good trade, a developing trade, but a good trade with Russia.
And in that advisory opinion, guidance published by the UK government in January of this year, 14 countries are included within that list. Armenia is one of them. What is particularly unique about Armenia, do you think? Gary Cartwright, that I interviewed earlier, said that Armenia is the only country which is helping Russia in terms of circumvention and simultaneously wants to be a member of the European Union. Would you say that this is one of the fundamental elements distinguishing Armenia from others?
That is probably the fundamental element there. I think, if you look around Armenia and if you look at the other countries of the region, one may think, okay, why was not, for instance, Georgia put on that same wanting list? Georgia, as we know, flirted with the European Union. There is a different situation today, but one may have put that there in as well because of not being put there. So probably the assessment was Georgia is less of a conduit than Armenia is. There is also a fundamental difference there. Armenia is seeking very proactively a role within the accession group in the European Union. So I think for the UK government to have made that decision, clearly there must have been enough evidence to make them politically go into that route. Yeah, because it is a warning sign on a country which is acceding to the EU. Arguably, of course, the UK is no longer a member of the EU, but also arguably UK is very linked to the EU, and especially now with the new prime minister in the UK and the old new leadership in Brussels. Not everything has changed in the new leadership in Brussels, but definitely the relation in between the two is extremely good. Look at the security elements, look at the common defense programs. So it is a very, very close relationship. The fact that the UK took that decision against an accession country to the EU and a very proactive accession country in the EU means clearly that there was enough evidence to show that probably Armenia is indirectly or directly helping Russia in circumventing Western sanctions. And may I remind everybody that the UK sanctions regime against Russia is one of the toughest. So if we look at the toughest regimes, probably one would think US, UK, EU, probably in that order. So the fact that that has happened clearly, I think, shows that they have evidence that Armenia is helping Russia in a way or another, indirectly or directly.
Leaving the morality of this story aside, there's no doubt in anybody's mind that Armenia's relationship with Russia is very complex, and that Armenia, as being a small nation and stuck between major players, is facing difficult decisions. I think this is what you yourself argued in one of your recent articles. And also, Armenia is not a passive observer, advertently bolstering Russia's economic resilience under sanctions. I mean, would it be fair to say that, in fact, when you classify those countries as helping Russia actively or not so actively, directly, not so indirectly, Armenia could be classified on the Russian camp when it comes to Russia's war efforts in Ukraine? It must have been the case since February 2022. I mean, we know that Iran and China, their attitude should be distinguished from other attitudes. We know that there are sanctions imposed on Belarus, on Iran as well. But would you classify Armenia on the Russian side when it comes to this wider confrontation, when it comes to the reality of the case?
I think if you look generally at the region, such states, be it Armenia, be it Georgia in that case, they had very difficult geopolitical equations to solve, or at least to calm down. But I think they took very different routes. So in the case of Armenia, I think Armenia at the beginning, probably of the confrontation, was a bit reluctant, didn't know where to go. But more and more we go into that, and we are now already in the third year of that, one could see that Armenia probably started leaning towards Russia more and more. And where one can see that, I'm looking mostly at the economic relations in between the two, at the trade balance or imbalance. And you can see that the economic relation between the two in the last 3 years has multiplied by a very, very high factor. So something has happened economically. In other words, the exchanges in between the two have increased dramatically in the last few years, which to me shows that basically leaning towards Russia was basically what Armenia decided to do for whatever reasons. It may be a relatively small country in a difficult zone with a big neighbor called Russia on one side, and probably looking at, what can I do with that relationship? And we can see it a bit also in Georgia. So Georgia has shifted dramatically from a fully pro-European, accession state to a much more reluctant, let's see what we do state. However, in the case of Georgia, you don't have the same economic relationship. So in other words, you do not have the multiple-fold multiplication of the economic relations with Russia that you see in Armenia's case.
Amongst those countries in South Caucasus, would you say Armenia is, in terms of its interaction with Russia, in terms of its connectedness to Russia, is actually number one trade partner for Russia? And
probably, if not, I do not know if it's number one, but definitely it is one of the top partners of Russia today in the region. Looking at
which is quite an interesting moment in many ways, because the current government in Tbilisi, Georgian Dream government, is described as pro-Russian. Azerbaijan quite often has been accused of having close ties with Russia for not joining anti-Russian coalition, although after what happened after the airplane crash, I think that the attitude towards Azerbaijan in that particular respect also, I think, has changed, with Azerbaijan showing its very pronounced independence and so forth. But it's quite interesting that Armenia, which is closely connected with Russia, is being perceived most pro-Western nation in the South Caucasus. What does underpin this sort of artificial perception?
I think, first of all, Armenian diplomacy was probably extremely active in actually creating connections at the highest possible levels. And one very clear proof of that, I think, is the last-minute agreement signed with the previous US administration, so with the then Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, and that has happened literally in the last few days of the administration. It is quite unexpected that something like that would happen. So normally administrations will refrain from signing such agreements just days before a new administration takes over, especially if that administration is from the bipartisan camp, and that was the case today. It remained to be seen what the Republican administration will do with that. It is a choice of President Trump. This is foreign policy matters. But the fact that the Armenian diplomacy succeeded in having such an agreement signed shows to me that they were extremely efficient in terms of negotiating higher up. They also understood that by negotiating with the United States in defense matters and in foreign affairs matters, they will influence significantly the European Union way of looking at them in an indirect but highly efficient manner. So I think the way in which that diplomacy played is definitely above the size of Armenia or above the facts. So if you look again at the economic relations, then clearly that will tell us a different story. But if you look at the diplomatic language that the Armenian diplomacy has used, basically that is a language of we need you, please don't allow us to be in a very difficult position. We are fully pro-Western in this region. You can trust us in this region. So the narrative is very different from what the economic relations show us.
Effectively, close relations with Russia, but diplomatically, rhetoric-wise, the language based on that we need Western support in order to free ourselves from the shackles of Russian domination, whatever that Russian domination and its economic benefits for Armenia may entail. And my last question to you, Mr. Altinau. Armenia wants to join the European Union. It's its declared objective. Lots of people believe that it's not a realistic ambition, in particular bearing in mind its economic relations with Armenia, with Russia, and its participation in the Eurasian Economic Union. I think everybody does understand that if Armenia wants to be part of the European Customs Union, they have to leave Russia-dominated Eurasian Economic Union. During the accession process, during those negotiations, there will be a moment when Armenia will be required to take a decision, sort of a drastic decision. When do you expect that time to come, or do you think that it's too early to talk about that stage?
Probably at this moment it is too early, in the way that is typically one of the last stages of the negotiations. So the negotiations will go around chapters. There are many. There are very important ones such as justice, also such as internal market. So those types, agriculture. So those things are going to take quite a long time. But you are very right in pointing out that down the line, and that line may be in a few years, 3-4 years from now, Armenia will need to make a choice. Because without a customs union, there is no accession. The accession cannot go to the last stage. And with a customs union, that is the customs union. In other words, you cannot have two customs unions. You can only have one. And there will need to be a choice by then. I think that by then, probably Armenia calculates that economically they can grasp as many low-hanging fruits today to increase their economic ability to refuse those low-hanging fruits tomorrow. So basically, it's an investment for a few years down the line, but at a given moment, there will need to be a choice, one way or the other, for sure.
Mr. Altinau, thank you very much indeed for your time. Thank you. This was Vlad Altinau, Senior EU Legal and Policy Expert, who joined us from Brussels, Belgium. See you very soon indeed.